Okay, and if we don't get through tonight, if we don't get through all the slides tonight, that's fine. We'll pick it up next week. Because I know that the next arguments that we're going to go to, the cosmological arguments, we'll almost certainly spend 2 weeks on. And then the ones after that, the teleological argument, we'll probably spend 3 weeks on. Because they're, some people oftentimes ask for tangible evidence, physical evidence, because many non-believers believe in what we call materialism, right? Which is that only the material world exists. And so they want hard, like scientific evidence. And so those are going to be the ones that typically, if somebody's going to kind of come awake at the idea of God, the cosmological and the teleological arguments are ones that often will win people over. And actually the moral arguments as well. But tonight we are going to be covering the ontological arguments. It's actually we'll actually present 2 different versions, okay? So I'll give you a little bit of historical background, and we will talk about Anselm's argument. Now, I will tell you right up front, Anselm's argument, who was the original guy that came up with the ontological argument, many philosophers believe that it was debunked, that the way he put it, it does not work philosophically. I don't fully agree with that, but I will say that it's a lot harder one to argue for. Okay, then we're going to cover the modal ontological argument, and that one is, at least in my opinion, and in the opinion of many philosophers, is pretty airtight. Okay, and the interesting thing about these two is they come all from reason. 100% from reason. You never have to pick up a Bible. You don't have to know any science, really. It's all from reason. Okay, so if you're ever challenged, hey, okay, we'll talk about God, but you're not allowed to use the Bible. This is one of them. You can go, okay, let's roll. Okay? Now, proof. When people ask for proofs, okay, proofs that God exists, proofs that this exists or that exists, the reality is we can't prove almost anything in the universe. Truthfully, you can't actually prove much of anything. René Descartes was a famous philosopher who used to say, I think, therefore I am. And he actually held that was the only thing he knew with absolute certainty. So you'll sometimes hear the term Cartesian certainty. That's what they mean. If you hear somebody say the word Cartesian certainty, they're saying 100% proof, okay? And I'll be the first to tell you, 100% proofs hardly exist. I know that this is a breakfast. I usually say I know what I ate for breakfast. I didn't eat breakfast this morning, but I know, as an example, yesterday what I ate for breakfast. Can I prove it to any of you? No. Right? In fact, we can't actually prove that we're not essentially in the matrix. Right? I actually listened to a very interesting lecture about 3 days ago about the fact that in some ways quantum mechanics actually looks at a model that essentially is almost the matrix. They come to a point to where they almost say that if you're not observing it, it doesn't actually exist. If I'm not observing that chair, it doesn't actually exist. That it's just kind of theoretically there until I observe it. Okay? I didn't say I agree with that, but my point is there are people who are almost going to the side of saying essentially that we live in the matrix. Okay? Now, remember from a couple weeks ago, philosophical arguments aren't yelling matches, right? That is not what philosophical arguments are. They are discussions about the way we reason to something, okay? They always start with at least 2 premises because we're going to be talking about deductive arguments today, right? So those are ones, remember, that they have at least 2 premises, they have a conclusion, and if the 2 premises are true and follow from each other, then you have a valid, sound argument, and that's it. The conclusion definitively comes from the premises, right? And so those are things like all humans are animals, Jim is a human, therefore Jim is an animal, okay? Tonight's arguments are deductive. And remember, we've said this from the beginning, all beliefs begin with a claim. In our case, what's the claim? God exists, right? It says it in about a bazillion different verses in the Bible, God exists. But now we have to talk about why we believe that. Again, especially when talking with an atheist or an agnostic, we have to be able to do that and not have to necessarily rely on the Bible, even though we know that he exists because the Bible says so, okay? So again, we're using a classical apologetic model where it's a two-step approach, right? Where we go from arguments for God's existence, or what we call theistic arguments. So this is the first week of the theistic arguments, right? And then we go from theistic arguments to showing that Christianity is the right religion to worship the Creator God. The Bible says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Psalm 14:1. And as if that wasn't enough, they say it again. So the Bible says it again in Psalm 53:1. The fool says in his heart, God does not exist. They are corrupt and they do vile deeds. There is no one who does good. And as if we needed more, concept of the fact that knowledge comes from God, Proverbs 1:7 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. So this is St. Anselm of Canterbury. He was the Bishop of Canterbury, lived in the 11th century, and he is the first to be credited for the ontological argument. Now, it's an interesting book that argument actually came out of. It was called the Proslogion, and I had to read parts of it when I was in my degree, but if you actually read the whole book, it's actually basically an extended prayer. It's basically a book-long prayer. And it comes in the second chapter where he puts forward his ontological argument. Now, he didn't call it that, okay? It was later named the ontological argument. But he is the one who came up with it. So the first question is, well, what the heck is ontology? Well, you'll hear two terms, and they oftentimes get misused. But ontology is the study of what is true or real of nature. In other words, it's the study of what exists, okay? What is the nature of existence? What exists? How do we know? Well, not how do we know. How do we know is epistemology. But what is in existence, right? Epistemology is how do we know what we know? And I've said in previous meetings that we have what's called a revelational epistemology. When somebody says, how do you know? We pick up the Bible and say, because God said. Okay? Other people have to come up with a reason that they know what they know. Okay? But we're talking now about ontology. So we're talking about existence, the existence of God. Now, one of your study questions is, what is an a priori argument? An a priori argument is simply one, and that's what we're going to be doing tonight, is one where you don't have to show evidence. You don't have to show from experience or from data, okay? Most of the rest of the arguments that we're going to be dealing with, in fact, I can't think of one that isn't, is what they would refer to as an a posteriori, meaning that it's from evidence, pieces of physical hard evidence. That's how you're making your argument, right? Like the teleological argument looks at the design of the universe. Well, you have to point to the different pieces of data in the universe to make that argument. Here you don't have to do that. We're simply using an a priori argument. Is basically, think of it as it's just an argument where we just use logic. That's it, okay? Everybody clear on that? Because those two things get mixed up a lot. Sometimes even by people who honestly really should know better because of the philosophy they've taken. Okay, any questions so far? All right. So again, we're going to go to St. Anselm's argument. And essentially what he said was, if it is possible that God exists, then it is logically following that God really does exist. And right off the bat, you should be saying to yourself, that's too easy, right? Because it is. that part is too easy. That's too simplified of a way of thinking of it. But that's really what all ontological arguments come down to. If you can prove that God is possible, then God exists. Okay? So you can probably already start to think of some ways that people are going to say, wait a minute, that's garbage, right? So let's go through the different steps. And I'm going to break them down into like more normal English, because remember, this was written in Latin, okay? So Anselm said that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So, in other words, think of the greatest possible being you can conceive of. He has all the greatest powers in the world, right? Power, benevolence, all-knowing, anything, right? That's God. God is the greatest that you can possibly even conceive of. And by definition, that's what God is. Because if you can conceive of anything greater than that, then that would be God, right? So there he kind of, like, most people will say, okay, yeah, that's just the definition of God, right? Well, then he said, there are only two ways in which something can exist. It can exist in your mind as truly just a conception of something, or it can exist in reality, right? This bottle of water. I can conceive of a bottle of water, but then there's also the physical bottle of water before me. It's only two ways. I mean, and let's face it, that's pretty simple, right? It can either exist only in your mind, or it can exist in your mind and in reality. Everybody following so far? Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Then he says, any good thing would be better if it existed in reality rather than just in our minds. Okay, so let's go to the concept of God for a second. If we can conceive of a maximally great being, is it better for that maximally great being, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, is it better for that being to exist only in our minds, or in our minds and in reality? Which one's better? Which ones do you think? In reality, right? And then he says, if God existed only in our imaginations, he wouldn't be the greatest thing that we can conceive of, because we could conceive of all that in reality. So God in reality would be better. Again, it seems pretty straightforward. And then number 5 is, therefore, God must exist in reality. Okay? Now, there are modern philosophers who still hold that St. Anselm's version of the ontological argument is valid. But there are many people who object. Okay? And they typically fall back to a guy who was around at the same time as Anselm. 1078, by the way, was when he came up with the proslogion. Okay? And it's this guy named Guanillo, and he talked about the perfect isle. And he basically just substituted the perfect isle in for the greatest conceivable being. Okay, and he said, well, I can imagine an island that there's no greater island. And if I can imagine that, it would be better for that to exist in the real world than in just my mind. Therefore, the greatest possible island exists. Now, on the surface, that sounds fine. On the surface, it sounds like Guanillo has defeated Anselm, right? Anybody not agree?
Yeah, I always have to go. An island would have to adhere by laws and things that only a God. I mean, I would argue against, because it would have to be constructed by something other than the island itself.
Well, and even more basic than that, I agree with you, Dave, but even more basic than that, what makes the greatest possible island?
Who says it?
Right? Maybe I like it at 80 degrees with 76 palm trees. but maybe Tony likes it at 84 with 132 palm trees and black sand rather than white sand, right? Or what if it were 1 square foot bigger? Or what if Alan liked a deserted island, but Todd wanted an island with resort hotels and all the amenities, right? In other words, he's making a fallacy there because he's taking something that is subjective and can change, right? Rather than the greatest possible being, right? He's making a fallacy there. But many will say that because of the way that Anselm's argument is listed, there are problems with it. Let me go back to it for just a moment. And it's really in 3 and 4 that most people object. Here's why. Any good thing would be better if it existed in reality rather than just in our minds. And many people, many modern philosophers will say, well, is that always true? Is that always true? Because in order for this argument to hold, you got to think about it, it has to always hold, right? If it really is a valid argument, it has to be true in kind of every way. Well, I would argue with you that donuts are good. But I would also argue with you that a lot of the times when I can conceive of a really good donut, it's probably not better that donut exists in reality for my body. Okay? So because of that, many modern philosophers don't believe that Anselm's version of the argument holds. And I think we can see why. Right? Because you can conceive of a lot of great things that in reality maybe aren't necessarily better than the way we conceive it.
That's arguing back toward God because he defines what is good, because water to a drowning man is bad,
right?
To a man in the desert is good. So,
exactly. And so there are still some philosophers, modern Christian philosophers, who do hold that Anselm's work is valid. But most don't, okay? But I give it to you as a background, okay? So let's get to the more modern guys, but there are modern versions of the ontological argument which are much more airtight. So guys like Charles Hartshorne, guys like Norman Malcolm, and perhaps most importantly, Alvin Plantinga. Alvin Plantinga was a philosopher at Notre Dame University for many, many years. He worked on the free will argument and on what's called the Modal Ontological Argument, and his version is the one we're going to be talking about tonight, okay? So it is what is known as the Modal Ontological Argument. Now, we already know what an ontological argument is. It's the concept of if you can imagine that a God exists, then a God exists, right? It's talking about existence. What does the modal part mean? Well, it uses modal logic. Okay, now who here has actually ever studied modal logic other than me? Okay, right. So by definition, we then need to go over some definitions, okay? Once we do, though, it's going to make a lot of sense, okay? It uses some funny terms, but once you understand those terms, it's actually really pretty intuitive. And in reality, we use it every day and just kind of don't ever think about it, okay? So the first term you need to understand is possible world, okay? Modal logic works in possible worlds, okay? What do they mean by a possible world? It doesn't mean another world exists. It doesn't even mean another universe exists. It means it's a hypothetical situation where something could exist. In other words, there's a possible world where unicorns actually existed, right? That's a possible world. there's a possible world where we're not sitting at the fellowship hall of Masters Baptist Church in Whitmire, South Carolina. You could imagine it. In other words, as long as you can imagine it, and it's not self-contradictory or self-defeating to have it, that's a possible world. There's a possible world where the sky is green instead of blue, where clouds rain gumdrops instead of water. Everybody following so far? Super simple, right? In other words, there's a possible world where pigs fly. Okay? I like that one. A lot of times, most of these videos you watch, they'll say unicorns. I got sick of unicorns, so I went with the pigs flying, right? So there's a possible world where pigs actually can fly. They have wings, they fly, okay? Now, there are three ways to define an entity in modal logic. The first is impossible. Impossible. And that's an entity that does not or cannot exist in any possible world. Perfect example, you can't have a round triangle. You cannot have a married bachelor. You cannot have a three-sided square. They are impossible. They are logically incoherent is the term that you'll hear, right? I mean, a married bachelor, by definition, like definitions, right? If you contradict a definition, it's impossible.
Military intelligence.
Amen. It is impossible to have a military intelligence. That's perfect. Okay, so everybody got impossible. Impossible is probably the easiest one. Then there's one called contingent. And what a contingent entity is an entity that exists in some possible worlds, but not all possible worlds. And that is my flying pig. Okay? So flying pig can happen in certain worlds, and this world doesn't exist, therefore it is contingent. Okay? And then the last one is necessary. In other words, it has to exist in all possible worlds. Okay? So three: impossible, contingent, necessary. An example of necessary beings: numbers. It is inconceivable to conceive of a world where numbers don't exist. Because remember, numbers are not the visual representation of the number 3. Numbers are abstract concepts, okay? Many people will say that absolute truths are necessary, like the law of non-contradiction. You can't be P and not P at the same time, right? That's going to be true of all possible worlds, right? A flying pig can't be a flying pig and not a flying pig at the same time. Doesn't make sense, right? And shape definitions. Like I said, triangles, squares, circles, right? It doesn't make sense to have a circle with a flat side. They're logically incoherent. So it's necessary, right? So again, the number 12, many people would say, is a necessary entity. A triangle has 3 sides, right? If it only has 2, that's not a triangle. So the next thing is, how do we define God in modal logic? This is not how we define God in modal logic. In fact, it's not actually how we define God in any way, shape, or form, but in Renaissance painting, that's what God looked like, right? Flowing white beard, halo around his head, all that kind of stuff, despite the fact that the Bible says God is spirit, right? So it's not that. Instead, God is a maximally great being, very similar to Anselm's greatest conceivable being, right? But a maximally great being. And specifically what they mean is it's a being that possesses all qualities that it's better to have than not have. Okay? Like, and they call these, by the way, great-making properties. Okay? Great-making properties are things like, whoops, why did it go back through again? There we go. Great-making properties are things like necessity, right? Remember, a necessary being exists in all worlds. Who would argue with you that it's better to be in all worlds all possible worlds, then only in some possible worlds. I can't fathom why that would be true of God, right? So necessity, love. It is better to be loving than hating. It's better to have power than to be weak. It's better to have wisdom than to be ignorant. And all of those have to be pegged out. So we call those the omni properties of God. So you oftentimes hear things like omnibenevolent, meaning all kind, all good, right? Omnipotent, all powerful. Omniscient, all present. Okay? Everybody following so far? And it can't have any qualities that are bad to have, like imperfection, corruption, which we call lesser making properties. So God is a maximally great necessary being. Okay? Remember, necessary means exists in all world. Okay? So necessity would be one of those. And the reason we believe this is because of verses like this. Colossians 1:16, for by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. So, let's go now to the actual argument. Before we do, anybody have any questions about any of our definitions so far? I told y'all I was going to get intellectual tonight, but I'm trying to keep it as straightforward as possible. So, in the modal ontological argument, there are several steps. First, it is possible that God, remember, designated as a maximally great being, exists. That seems simple, right? It's possible God exists. The second one, if it's possible that God exists, then God would exist in some possible worlds. Okay? Number 3, if God exists in some possible worlds, then God exists in all possible worlds. You understand why that would be? Because God would need all great-making properties, one of which is necessity, meaning he exists in all possible worlds. 4, if God exists in all possible worlds, then God exists in the actual world. 5, if God exists in the actual world, then God exists. Okay? Now, what are the objections to the argument? Which premise do you think, out of the argument, people actually complain about? Which one? Raise your hand if you think number 2 is the one they attack the most. Okay, what about number 3? Raise your hand if you think number 3 is the one that most atheists would object to. 4?
I'm just trying to think of anything that's created other possible worlds other than just this one.
Yeah, but remember, a possible world is just a hypothetical situation. Can you imagine it? Here's a perfect example. We'll use our flying pig. A possible world is exactly like ours, except it has a flying pig in it. That's a possible world. Okay? So it doesn't mean we're on Mars or anything like that. It just means one thing changed. I'll go even simpler than that. A possible world would be one in which I just sneezed 15 seconds ago. Everything else is the same. So it's just hypothetical scenarios. Okay, what about 4? If God exists in all possible worlds, then God exists in the actual world. No, that's that one they don't attack, right? That one's super straightforward, because if he exists in all possible worlds, then he exists in the actual world, and then of course 5 just follows directly from that. So the one they actually attack is number 1. But that's a tough hill to climb. Think about it. If an atheist tries to convince someone it is not possible that God exists. Because see, as it turns out, 2 through 5 just follow modal logic. That's why I went into all that detail about modal logic. Because if you understand those definitions of modal logic, 2 through 5, according to philosophers, even atheist philosophers, 2 through 5 is airtight. It just builds on itself, right? Think about 2. If it's possible that God exists, then God exists in some possible world. Yeah, that's the definition of possible, contingent, right? If God exists in some possible worlds, then God exists in all worlds. Why? Because of modal logic, it's better to have necessity than to be contingent or impossible. And then 4 follows from that. If he exists in all possible worlds, then he exists in the actual world. Nobody's going to argue with that one. If they do, turn around and walk away, because that argument's just beyond reason. And then 5, of course, just follows from 4. Okay? So, a lot of times what they try to do is they try to set up situations where they say it is not possible for God to exist. And they'll oftentimes, the one that most people will go to is something called the omnipotence paradox. It goes something like this. Can God create a stone that he cannot lift or cannot move or whatever? Right? Because you stop and think about that. If God can create a stone that he cannot move, then he's not all powerful. Because he doesn't have the power to move the stone. If, however, God cannot create a stone that's so heavy he can't move, then he's not all powerful because he can't create the stone. That's what they'll say. What's the problem with that? It's logically absurd. Right? We don't define God or omnipotence as being able to do the logically impossible. God, by definition, is ordered. Reason comes from God. We don't believe, that's a straw man. We don't believe in a God that can do logically incoherent things. Right? I don't believe that God can create a married bachelor, because the definition of the word bachelor is that he isn't married. Right? And in fact, even the Bible says there are things God can't do. It's impossible for God to lie. That's why it's a straw man. Everybody know what a straw man is? It's setting up a little tiny, fake version of the argument you're trying to argue against, just so it's easy to huff and puff and blow it over. That's a straw man argument. Right? We don't believe that God can do something that's logically incoherent. And again, we believe there are things that God can't do. Like in James 1:13, let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot, read, it is not possible, God cannot be tempted with evil. Neither tempteth he any man. Right? We don't believe it's even possible for God to have evil in him. So we don't define God as omnipotent, meaning that he can do things that's logically incoherent. It's a straw man. Okay? So again, asking the question, can God do something like create a stone he can't lift or can't move? That's logically absurd. It's like asking, what's the smell of a triangle? It makes no sense. What's the taste of green? Despite what little 5-year-old kids say that, green tastes different than red. No. Lime tastes different than cherry, but green doesn't taste different than red, right? I'm going to orange the wet sprocket. Like, they're words. Each word means something. The sentence means nothing. Right? So it's logically absurd. But that's the premise that they use to attack that argument. They'll say it is impossible for God to exist. In fact, guys like Richard Dawkins. Everybody know who Richard Dawkins is? He's one of the most well-known anti-theists in the world. Turns out he's actually a biologist. And he's a terrible philosopher. He's not a philosopher. He doesn't have any training. So he actually tried to make an argument where he said it would actually be better for God to have created the world by not existing than existing. He tried to use the ontological argument to say that it would be better if God didn't exist and created the world than if he does exist and created the world, because which one would be more incredible? Well, it's not what we're trying to say with the ontological argument at all. What are we actually saying with the ontological argument? We're simply saying that by definition, God is a necessary being. We're saying that if you can even have the possibility of God, in the modal argument, if God can exist, then he can exist in some worlds. If he can exist in some possible worlds, then it would be better, maximally great, if he existed in all worlds. If he exists in all worlds, he exists in the actual world. If he exists in the actual world, he exists. You see, here's the problem a lot of times with atheists in terms of getting in a philosophical argument with theists. They try to put all the burden of proof on us. This argument, in my opinion, puts the burden of proof back onto them, because they have to then argue that it's not even possible that God exists. Because there's basically not a philosopher out there who thinks that 2 through 5 of the modal ontological argument is not airtight. It is. 2 through 5 is airtight because it literally just follows modal logic. So if an atheist if you give them this argument and they try to argue with you that it's not even possible God exists, then you need to put that burden of proof on them. Say, prove to me it's not possible. Now, another argument you'll oftentimes hear is people will try to substitute, just like Guinello did with Anselm's. They'll try to put a different object, like a bottle of water, or we'll use a pizza. Here's a perfect example. They'll say it is possible that a maximally great pepperoni pizza exists. If a maximally great pepperoni pizza exists in some worlds, then a maximally great pepperoni pizza exists in all worlds, because it would be better for it to exist in all worlds rather than some worlds, some possible world. If it exists in all possible worlds, just like the ontological argument, if it exists in all possible worlds, it exists in the actual world, therefore a maximally great pepperoni pizza exists. What's the problem with that?
Whose version is maximally great?
Right. What defines maximally great when it comes to a pizza? Is that pizza 12 inches or 18? Is it thick crust or thin crust or hand tossed? Does it have garlic garlic butter on the crust, or does it not? Are there 76 pepperoni slices on it or 172? Right? Even more importantly, what by definition is pizza? It is food. Right? In order for it to exist in all worlds, it can't be eaten. Therefore, by definition, it's not a pizza. So they're making what they call a category error, right? They're using a contingent object, meaning it can exist in some worlds, and they're applying it to the definition of God, but you can't do it, right? Pepperoni pizza is the perfect example. If pepperoni pizza was maximally great, I'd be able to eat it, but then it wouldn't exist in all worlds, right? So, I understand that these arguments are kind of tough, but if you can remember the definition of the modal logic definitions, impossible, contingent, and necessary, and you can explain to someone what that means, and then take them through those 5 steps, again, the only one that even has any realistic objections to it is step 1. It is possible that a maximally great being we call God exists. And at that point, if they're willing to argue that with you, well, put the burden of proof on them. Prove to me it is not possible that God exists. Because as long as it's possible, the modal logic in that argument is airtight. airtight. Okay? So, that's it. I kept it pretty short because I knew it's pretty intellectually heavy. The next week, we're going to start talking about the cosmological arguments, the arguments from the existence of the universe and the beginning of the universe. And we'll talk about one that's very similar to this one, but it kind of builds on it. And so what I would encourage you to do is really think about and remember those three definitions: contingent, impossible, and possible. Okay. Or sorry, necessary. Necessary, possible, or contingent, and impossible, okay? Think about those definitions because they are important when we talk about Leibniz and his argument for his cosmological argument, okay? No questions. So it's all crystal clear now, right?
You said put the burden of proof on them on point number one.
Yeah.
So what are some of the common proofs they have if they want to argue that God doesn't, it's impossible to God?
Yeah, the most common is the problem of evil, which we will cover in great detail when we start talking about moral arguments for God's existence. That is by far the most common. They will say it is impossible for an omnibenevolent God to exist and for suffering and evil to exist. They'll oftentimes say, things like, if an all-powerful, all-loving God existed, then evil wouldn't exist. Evil exists, so either God's not all-loving, or meaning that he's powerful enough to stop suffering and evil, but he's not loving enough to do it, or he's not powerful enough to stop evil and suffering. Alvin Plantinga is one of the guys who has really shouldered the burden of work on debunking that argument, but that is oftentimes the argument they will use, is the argument from the problem of evil. That'll be covered when we're talking about the moral arguments for God's existence. Yeah. The short answer is that the answer to that is the free will defense. What's called the free will defense, which is, in short, basically saying that love is not love without free will. It is not love if I kidnap a woman and force her to be my wife. She does not love me. She's doing it out of obligation. So in order for you to have true love in the world, God had to give people free will to make choices. And in giving people free will to make choices, people will ultimately make poor choices because we live in a fallen world. That's the short response to it. But we'll go into that in a lot of detail when we talk about the moral arguments.
So from a logical standpoint on what we're covering today, what is your proof that God exists outside the Bible?
Yeah, so basically the simplified way of saying it to somebody is using modal logic. If it is even possible that God exists, then it follows logically that God exists.
So you move right into step 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yep. You would sit, and that's how you would put it. Like if you were talking to somebody, you would say, I'm going to use modal logic and I'm going to explain to you how if it's even possible God exists, then by definition, God exists. Now, you may have to take the time to explain to them what an impossible thing is, what a necessary thing is, and what a contingent thing is. But once you do that, and maybe even you may even have to define what you mean by God, right? Now keep in mind, this is not an argument to the triune God of Christianity, because we're doing a two-step apologetic. We just want to get them to believe that God exists. So this would not be one you would use with a Muslim or a Mormon or a Jew. This would be one that you would use with an agnostic or an atheist. And you say, you give them those definitions. It's impossible if it is not possible in any world, like a triangle with two sides, a rounded square, a married bachelor. It's contingent if it's possible in some worlds, but not all. A flying pig. It's necessary if it exists in all worlds, like numbers, definitions, right? By definition, a triangle is a three-sided object with angles that add up to 180 degrees. That's it. That's a necessary thing. And then you explain to them what a great making property is, and that's how we define God, as having all of the most of all great making properties, none of the lesser making properties, and we say it is a great making property to be necessary. But you don't even have to say that, because the argument itself says that, right? You simply say it's better to be good than bad. It's better to be loving than hateful. It's better to be powerful than weak. I mean, because that's just the definition of God. That's how we define God. Now, if they want to argue with you about that, then the reality is it's probably not a discussion that's ultimately going to come to any reasonable fruition for anybody, because you do ultimately have to agree on the language you're using. And if they're not even willing to agree with that, that's why I said probably don't even put the necessity in there, right? Because that comes in that comes in the definition of the word necessity, or necessary being, and in the argument itself. And then you just take them through the argument. Because at first, when you first say that, when you say, if it is even possible that God exists through modal logic, then by definition God exists, they're going to go, you're full of mud, right? They're going to. Quite frankly, I don't blame them, because they probably don't know any of these definitions. But once you know the definitions, 2 through 5 are absolutely airtight. Only the question of, is it even possible that God exists, is really under question, especially if you talk about academics. Because I don't care what the hack atheist on YouTube says. I do care about people who spend their lives thinking about these things. And again, at that point, you've got to put the burden of proof on them, because quit playing defense. We've got to quit playing defense. We need to play offense. The best defense is good offense, right? So you say to them, look, you're going to have, you at this point have to shoulder the burden of proving that there is not even the possibility of God.
Okay, so the necessity would be absolute fact.
Necessary, remember, a necessary being is one that exists in all possible worlds.
Yeah.
Like numbers.
Okay. But society today is attacking what would be like, those agreeable terms.
Mm-hmm. That's why I said you're going to have to start by making sure that you all agree on the definitions of what you're talking about. You do have to do your work here, right? You'll have to do your work. So we'll do a little role play. All right, you're going to be my atheist today, okay? And you're going to say, I don't believe God exists.
I don't believe God exists.
Okay. What if I told you that I can show you, using pure logic and not even touching a word of the Bible, that if it's even possible that God exists, then God exists? Okay. So, in order to do that, I'm going to make sure that we agree on some terms, okay? I'm going to use what's called modal logic. Have you ever heard of that before? No. Okay. So, in modal logic, which is an entire kind of area of philosophy, we have a couple of definitions. There's 4 definitions that I want us to agree on. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. The first is a necessary being, okay, or a necessary entity. And I'm sure you want to know, well, what does that mean? Well, a necessary entity is something that exists in all possible worlds, like numbers. So no matter what kind of world we can dream up, numbers and math and definitions exist, like the definition of a triangle. Would you agree that by definition a triangle is a three-sided object whose angles all add up to 180 degrees? You would agree with that?
Yes.
And that would be true no matter what kind of world we lived in, whether the sky was green or pigs flew or tables were upside down with the legs sticking up. Triangles would still be triangles with three sides. You agree? Okay. So that's a necessary being. And then there, on the other side is something that's impossible. Like, it's impossible to have a two-sided triangle. It's impossible to have a married bachelor, right? Things that are logically incoherent and couldn't exist in any possible world, that would be an impossible entity. So you would agree that like a married bachelor is impossible,
Yes.
or a two-sided triangle is impossible, right? Okay, so we've got necessary, we've got impossible, and then the third is contingent, and that means it can exist in certain worlds, some possible imaginations of worlds, or what we'll call possible worlds, but not in all. So like a unicorn. We can imagine a world where a unicorn exists, but unicorns don't actually exist in this world. Or we can imagine a world where pigs flew, but pigs don't fly in this world. You would agree?
Yes.
Okay, so we got those three. Now the fourth definition, and you may not agree with this one as much because you say you don't believe in God, and that would be the definition of God. And so I would define God as containing all what I'm going to call great-making properties. He's a being that has infinite power, infinite love, infinite knowledge, and doesn't have any bad qualities or what I would call lesser making qualities like hate or evil or ignorance, right? So you can agree, like most people believe God, if God exists, the definition of God is kind of the greatest possible thing, right? You would agree at least with that definition? Okay. So let me take you through a couple of arguments using that kind of logic. The first is that it's possible that God exists. The second is if it's possible that God exists, by those definitions we just agreed with, that means God exists in some possible worlds, right? Some hypothetical worlds God exists. You agree?
Yes.
Okay. So if God exists in some possible worlds, and we've defined God as having like all the greatest possible powers, it would actually mean that God had necessity. And we define necessity as being in all possible worlds, right? So if God exists in some worlds, it's actually better if he existed in all worlds. So kind of by definition, he's in all worlds. And if God is in all worlds, then he's in the actual world. If he's in the actual world, then he exists. So my argument by those definitions that we just talked about is that if it's even possible God exists, then by that logic, God exists. So, like, what do you think about that?
It's possible.
That's where a role play falls apart because she already believes God exists. But at that point, probably she's going to come back and attack one of those. Now, if she attacks 2 through 5, you just simply go back and say, no, wait a minute. We started with the fact that we agreed on some definitions. 2 through 5 is just going and restating those modal logic definitions. So really the only one you can argue with is it's possible that God exists. And if they try to say, well, it's not possible God exists, you say, okay, well, why? Now you turn into Greg Kokel, right? Why? Well, because of such a... Okay, now look, at this point, you're going to have to prove to me that it's not even possible God exists. That's in your hands, not mine. I've done my due diligence. We agreed even on definitions. Now it's your turn to shoulder some burden here. You got to tell me why you think it's not even possible that God exists in any world. Because that's what they're trying to say, is it's not even possible for God to exist in any world. Because that's how we define possible, right? Or contingent. Possible and contingent basically mean the same thing.
And then you would say, well, you know, what proof do you have?
That's right.
And they would give you some unrational, basically it would boil down to their personal opinion, not going to be held accountable.
Yeah, or they'll use like the omnipotence paradox, and say, well, tell me this, if it's possible that God exists, then can God create a rock that's too big for him to lift? And that's when you would say, well, I wouldn't expect him to, because that's logically false. It's logically fallacious. It's self-contradictory. And we don't expect God to be able to do the logically impossible. That's not how we've defined God. That's not the God I worship. That's not the God that any Christian believes in. I've never met any Christian, no matter how progressive or how conservative, who believes that God can create a stone that he cannot lift. And if they did, I would tell them, you're being logically incoherent. What you're saying doesn't make sense. It's like asking, what is the smell of orange? Not an orange, the color. What is the taste of a square? It doesn't make sense. But you got to hold their feet to the fire at that point. You have to.
I don't want to belabor it. Do you find yourself being careful with terms like unicorn, since the King James does actually use that word once, or hate, when the Bible is clear that God hates divorce.
Mm-hmm.
There are 7 things God hates. Do you find yourself needing to be careful with the terminology of the words you use in this argument?
Yes, although with certain ones like unicorn.
Right. That's a mistranslation, of course.
It is, and the average pop atheist that you are going to encounter with this argument probably doesn't know that. But that's why. First of all, I just get tired of the term unicorn,
right.
So that's why I like flying pig. But that does help you there too. Flying pigs, like it's an imaginary thing.
Right.
In terms of definition, that's why you sometimes have to use the greater making property, lesser making property. And you could maybe even qualify and say hatred toward people versus hatred toward a thing, But yeah, you would have to be careful depending on how learned somebody was. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What about if there's only one world, there's not other worlds?
Well, but remember, how do we define a possible world? It's a hypothetical situation. It's just a hypothetical situation. Because that's the one I did forget to actually define for you, is what a possible world is. And remember, because they may say that, and that's a legitimate question for them to ask if you haven't defined what a possible world is. But a possible world is just a hypothetical situation. Right? It's truly just a hypothetical. Like I said, the hypothetical situation is that, there's a pizza sitting right here. Everything else about the world is the same, but a pizza sitting right there. That's a possible world. It's just a hypothetical situation. In a hypothetical situation, Alan drives a Toyota Prius. I know that's never going to happen, but it's truly just a hypothetical situation. And some people do get really bound up in that, and they have a hard time understanding what you're saying with that. And so sometimes you do have to be very specific in defining a possible world, because again, a possible world is literally just a hypothetical situation where things could be, or it could have been, right? It could have been that our solar system only had 6 planets instead of, well, I still always say 9 because I still believe in Pluto, but you know what I'm saying, where in a possible world, our galaxy didn't get named the Milky Way. It got named the computer way. Snicker, exactly. Reese's, whatever. But that is true. You do have to, they do have to understand, and they may say that if you forgot to define a possible world like I did, that is a legitimate question for them to ask. And you say, well, but they may say, well, but the only world that exists is this world. You say, yeah, but when I say a possible world, I literally just mean a hypothetical situation. In a hypothetical situation, pigs could fly. In a hypothetical situation, our cars could too, like the Jetsons, right? And you may even use that as an example. Like cartoon worlds, those are possible worlds. They're just imaginary hypothetical situations, like the Jetsons, where their cars flew, and they could push a button and the food just came out in half a second and was fully cooked. That's what a possible world is. Good question. We hope that you enjoyed the content of our video today. If you did, make sure to give us a thumbs up and share this content. Also, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and hit the bell so that you are alerted to any new content that we post on our channel. Please remember that all of our video content is completely free of charge and can be reposted, shared, and embedded. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/armorofgodapologetics with an S. Thank you for watching and have a blessed day.